We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the executive director of the School Funding Fairness Project. We're a nonprofit based here in Concord, but we do work across the state. Been around for a little over almost 4 years now as a formal organization, which is pretty exciting. Tonight we'll be doing a presentation ranging from what the current state of affairs are for school funding property taxes, how we got here, and then we'll wrap up with some of the kind of recent court rulings that came out 2 weeks ago yesterday, not that I'm counting, and some kind of legislative solutions heading into next year. But first off, how many people have been to some form of school funding property taxes presentations in the past 5 or 6 years? Oh, wow. Cool. How many people in the room are elected officials of any level in any statewide city? Very cool. Thank you for serving. Are there any board members of the project here? We have Doug and Mary. So for those of you who have seen some version of this in the past, this presentation has kind of undergone a lot of changes throughout the years, both from its origins, from some folks like John Tobin, who will be presenting with me tonight, and Andy Valinsky, through various iterations here at the project. We've done a lot of work on this in the past month or so this is a pretty different slide deck than we've shown in the past. And a lot of what we're trying to do is kind of center some more of the lived experiences of some folks and the people kind of like how this is impacting different people around the state. In addition to adding a lot about the recent court rulings, because obviously those are big pieces. So John and I will be going back and forth a few times throughout tonight. Should take about 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Please let us know if we have sound or visuals are not working. We'll try to adjust things as we can. But first, to get started here, kind of give a big overview of what we'll be talking about. School funding in the state impacts both taxpayers and students, and both are harmed by this. It's an inequitable system for both students and taxpayers. This is not a stagnant problem. This has been getting worse over time in various ways to varying degrees. And many elements of the system are deeply unconstitutional. This line means even more given the two rulings and elements of it. There's active lawsuits. Actually, I should acknowledge who here is a participant in one of the school funding lawsuits right now, or a plaintiff. All right, thank you we got two of the plaintiffs here in the house. And so I hope people understand throughout this that it is people, literally some of you sitting in the room, and people like you that are kind of engaging in changing the system, challenging it, whether it's in the courts as an elected official or as a constituent engaging with elected officials. So kind of start at a high level. I want to walk through what do we mean when we say inequitable? What does that look like? So let's go through a specific example. I'm going to show you two different high schools. These are stats we just pulled a few weeks ago. So the first public high school, 70% of 11th graders are proficient or above in math, 90% in reading. 96% of students graduate, 91% score a 3 or above. That's generally the range in which colleges will accept credit for an AP test, 3 or above. Teachers are making almost $80,000 on average. Median household income is $136,000. And all of that, education property taxes, that's both swept and local, are about $8 per thousand, which is a little under a $3,000 property tax bill on a home valued at $350,000. These are not conclusive stats. They paint a picture, though. What about high school B? Well, before we get there, high school A also, in 2022, was a recipient of a national blue ribbon school. Only a couple hundred get this every year. Sometimes as many as 3 or 4 in New Hampshire in a given year. It's a pretty high honor for a public high school. Now let's compare that to high school B. They're only 26% proficient above in math, 40% in reading. Only 78% of students graduate. Only 39% of AP test takers are scoring a 3 or above. Teacher salaries are under $50,000 on average. Median household income is $46,000. property taxes are higher at $1,250, resulting in a $4,300 bill just for the education portion of your property taxes. Some folks might recognize these schools. This is Hanover and Claremont. They're only 30 miles apart. Dramatically different experiences for both the students and the property taxpayers in these communities. And this is a pretty stark example, a pretty stark comparison to kind of prove the point. This happens all over the state. So a little bit more about where we are right now, and then we'll dig into how we got here. In 2020, there was a commission to study school funding. Basically looked at what's happening in school funding right now. Who here was on the 2020 commission to study school funding? Thank you for your service on that. That was a lot of work over a significant amount of testimony, committee meetings, gathering stakeholder input. And they kind of came away with two high-level conclusions. One, it's inequitable for both students and taxpayers. And two, there's this negative relationship between the district's outcomes and the levels of poverty. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. But this is painting a bit of the picture of where we are right now. The other fundamental piece to understand is the heavy reliance on property taxes, this where we are, right? Of all of our revenue for our school districts, 70% is coming from local property taxes. And I say 70%, that's because swept right here, while it's called a statewide education property tax, it is raised, retained, and kept locally. The state never touches that money. 70% of all funding comes from local property taxes. That's the highest proportion in the country relative to school funding. The amount that the state gives of these green pieces, it's about 20%. That is the lowest proportion in the entire country of how much the state contributes towards public education. And this extreme dichotomy, the low percent of funding from the state, high reliance on property taxes, kind of underscores the decades of lawsuits, the current lawsuits, and the deep inequities found in our state. So to kind of walk through how we got here, I'm going to hand it over to John for a bit.
Good evening. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for coming again. And I'm going to talk a little later in the program about the two recent rulings, but we thought it might make sense to give you a little bit of background about the Claremont case, what it said and what happened after it. That case was brought and pursued in the 90s by 5 school districts and some parents and some kids. And I was proud to be part of that case. It was led by Andy Valinsky and R.P. Saunders and a batch of volunteer lawyers. And after going up and down the appellate ladder a couple of times, we won. What did that mean? But before we talk about that, I just want to tell you a little bit about me and why I got into this case. In the 90s, in the early 90s, I was, well, actually, let me go back to the 80s. I was a young legal aid lawyer in Berlin, up north, and I had a couple of kids, and I heard about the Berlin school city budget meeting, and I had a couple of young kids, and I really wanted to make sure that those kids got a good education, got a good public education. And so I went to the Berlin City Hall all fired up to talk about they need to spend whatever they need to spend to make sure that my kids get a crack. And then I realized that there were some of my elderly neighbors there from Berlin. And what they were saying is, we really care about our public schools. We went to them, our kids went to them, but we can't afford the property taxes. And that's when I realized in that city hall that our state puts elderly taxpayers and students and parents in a box and makes them fight over scraps, especially in places like Berlin, where there's not much property wealth. So that really inspired me, and now I have to say I'm an elderly taxpayer. My kids are long gone, and we're still at it, and I'm optimistic that we're going to crack this nut. So what did the court say in Claremont? A couple of things, two really basic principles. One is that it's the state's responsibility to provide a constitutionally adequate education. And that's sort of a clunky phrase, constitutionally adequate. I'll talk about what that means in a minute. And the other is that the taxes that are raised to meet that state obligation have to be uniform in rate around the state. And they said that because it's a state duty, therefore those taxes are state taxes, and all state taxes have uniform rate around the state. And you think about the interest and dividends tax or rooms and meals tax, those rates don't vary around the state because they're fulfilling state obligations. So what did the court mean by constitutionally adequate education? They did not mean the bare minimum of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they were very specific about that. Instead, they expressed a really progressive and expansive vision. They were writing at the end of the 20th century, and they were thinking about decades and generations ahead for the students of New Hampshire. They said, we need to give our kids what they need to succeed in the modern world. And that's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but a broad exposure to science, technology, health, world languages, a range of things that kids need to succeed in the marketplace, in the state, in the country, in the world. And one of the other things they said was, this is not about local control. Yes, we have local control in terms of where the schools are and who administers them, but the state can't duck its responsibility by delegating things to local districts. They were very clear about that. So what happened after the Claremont rulings? One of the things they did was create the first statewide education property tax, and they set it at an average rate of about $6 per thousand. And they also created a fund for new, what they called adequacy aid. And so in the immediate year after that decision, local school taxes, as you can see, decreased very significantly. And even adding the statewide property tax, the overall education tax rate decreased significantly. The state started to pick up the ball, started to take on responsibility. And this is just a little bit of a side note. At that time, the legislature, both houses of the legislature were controlled by the Republican Party, and there was a Democratic governor. But that legislature was all set to, among other things, help think about funding public education with an income tax. And we know that the Democratic governor put the kibosh on that. But the point of this slide is not to advocate that in this moment, but to say at that point, people realized everything needed to be on the table, and a lot of surprising people had surprising ideas. And we'll get back to that later. So what's happened since then after the 20 years, and I think the title of this slide is a little bit too generous to the state. I think what's happened in the last 20 years is the state has slid backwards, has allowed things to get worse. And one of the things that happened was some of the towns that are property wealthy lobbied the legislature to get a discount on the swept. That's the thing called the excess tax. Another thing that we didn't even know about until we filed one of our recent cases is that there are some small towns where the Department of Revenue Administration essentially canceled out the swept completely and did what's called negative tax rates, enabling some mansions in some small towns to pay no swept. Meanwhile, the court again said it's on the legislature to fix this. But the bottom line, really, especially over the last 10 years, is the burden continued to shift toward local property taxpayers. And you can see the numbers. As the cost of education went up, more than $500 million in new money had to be raised by local taxpayers. And the state, over this period of time, kicked in only $47 million. So the state was dogging it. It was sliding backwards. It was not meeting its duty. And in order to fill the gap, all of us who own homes or businesses had to pay more and more local taxes. So back to the School Funding Commission. Why did that commission come into play? How did that get created? Well, it got created by the legislature in response to growing concern among all of us about this problem. In 2017, 2018, 2019, lots and lots of more people talked to their legislators and pushed for change. And so that prompted that commission to be created. And I have to give my friend Doug Hall, who's here tonight, it was his idea to set up a broad commission to look at this. I'll just say Doug Hall is one of my heroes. The commission, as Zach said, worked really hard, really dug into the numbers, got some national experts, really tried to figure this out, and came up with a report that not everybody agreed with, but it was an analysis and some proposals, and the legislature did nothing with it. So where are we left right now? The state says we're going to allocate $4,100 for every student and some additional allocations for kids that fit particular categories. And that all adds up to about $5,100 per kid in state aid across the state. Guess what? Here's a graph that shows you how much of the burden the state is bearing and how much we are all bearing through property taxes. And look at Concord. Concord's spending per pupil is a tiny bit below average. It's about average for the state. You can see the state average is about 20,000, and Concord's about 1,000 less than that. Where does Concord's money come from? Well, in that bar on the far left, you can see the sort of orangey yellow is the state's adequacy money, and the purple or blue part of it is the swept. And all the rest, the difference between that 5,000 and 19,000 comes from taxpayers here in Concord. And it's pretty similar. If you look at Manchester, they spend a lot less money. They have a property tax ceiling. If you look at Bow or Hopkinton, again, it's all on local taxpayers. And the swept and adequacy grants together are a tiny sliver of the actual costs. So, and here's another chance for me to tell about something that Doug did. We have done this project in a couple places, Allenstown, Hopkinton, Pittsfield. And the idea was, well, let's see how far the state allocation really goes when compared to an actual school district budget. So the state said in 2022, 2023, that Allenstown only needed about $4,900 per kid to fulfill its obligation to fulfill the state's obligation to provide an adequate education. The Allenstown budget was actually much higher than that. They were spending about $24,000. So the exercise was, what do we cut out of the existing Allenstown budget to get it down to what the state says is enough? So they pulled out the spreadsheets with the itemized spreadsheets of all the expenses for the school budget. The superintendent's office sat down and just started going through, what do we spend money on? And they started cutting. As you can see, all busing. So kids have to get there, they have to walk, or their parents have to bring them, or they don't get there. All special ed contracted services, all out-of-district placements. No supplies, copiers, liability insurance. No art, music, or PE equipment. No new textbooks. Couple secretaries gone. 3 of the 4 custodians gone. This is just the first page of this list. All summer programs, all food services, no more art teacher, music teacher, phys ed teacher, 1 of 2 nurses, both guidance counselors, crossing guards, technology person, assistant principal, all gone. And again, the idea is these things all cost money, and we're trying to cut in order to get down what the state says is enough. And they kept going, eliminating special ed paraprofessionals, reading specialist, the library specialist, all building and grounds maintenance, no superintendent, no audits. There were cheers for some of these, obviously, but only a few. So where did that leave them? That left them still far above what the state says was enough. So Allenstown sends its kids to Pembroke Academy under a tuition agreement. And in its desperation, how are we going to get down to that lower number? They decided to essentially eliminate all funding for kids beyond 8th grade in order to keep cutting to get down to what the state says was enough. So when they got to that, they were still above the adequacy level, so they had to cut more teachers. So as you can see toward the bottom there, in order to spend only what the state says is adequate, what the state will pay for adequate, they would have 29 students per teacher, K through 4, at grades 5 through 8, 38 student teachers, all those other services gone, and public education in Allenstown would end after the 8th grade. How can anyone think anywhere in the state that that's enough to pay for an adequate education? And again, we've done this exercise in Hopkinton, we've done it in Pittsfield, and it's just a very graphic way of saying, if you actually look at a budget, the state is in never, never land about what the grants can pay for and what they can't. So this, as we've said, and it's a persistent theme, now what happens? The state doesn't put in very much with its adequacy grants. You can see it's a tiny sliver, and it's not enough. So that falls on property taxpayers, and now Zach is going to take us through some of that.
So in order to make up that difference from what the state gives and was actually required, and also something with all of those hypothetical cuts that we just went through, most of those violated either state law, federal law, or collective bargaining agreements. So even if you wanted to, in some terrible world, you wouldn't be able to make many of those cuts for good reason. But even just, so the state's on one hand either requiring via law or through their rules and standards, requiring that school districts do this, right? And then providing funding that doesn't even let you get up to that bare minimum. And that was kind of a central piece of the Conval case too. But where the ability to raise that money falls to is largely local property taxpayers. So how does that work? So a quick example here to kind of walk you through the different ability of communities to raise this money. If there's a fixed cost for $10,000 that 2 school districts need to purchase, say Claremont and Hanover, right? Where they're purchasing from, if it's from Amazon or another supplier, they don't really care if they're in 2 different towns. It's a fixed cost. So say Hanover, they have a equalized property value of $1 million. Property tax rate of $10 per thousand, you raise your $10,000. But just down the road, Claremont has a equalized property value of only $400,000, just a smaller pool to pull from. That same tax rate doesn't get you as far. You only get $4,000 for it. So in order to raise the same amount of money, you have to have a tax rate 2.5 times as high. And what we see is that having that lower equalized value per pupil, which is just a good measure of comparing apples to apples, it's the amount of taxable property behind each student, right? So it helps us compare small communities to cities. Most students, 75%, live in communities around the state with below average property values. They live in communities that by definition have a harder time existing and thriving in this system because of the heavy reliance on property values. And something that's fun to point out here, because at this point in the presentation, it feels a little depressing sometimes. It's just a lot of how hard things are, conclusions about the inequities. We've talked about some 30-year-old lawsuits. Why haven't these things been changed, right? Up here, there is every sort of demographic in New Hampshire. There's our biggest cities, our smallest towns, communities in every single county. There's communities that are way on the left side of the political spectrum, way on the right, somewhere in the middle, right? So this is a problem that does not just affect a specific demographic, a specific party, a specific part of the state. To pull out a few examples here about kind of what we mean by this property value in general having such a strong impact on the community's ability to raise money. This is a chart that's showing every single town and community in the state. Just a handful are listed down here. And showing their equalized tax rates, their school tax rates, starting up at around $18 per thousand, all the way down to 0, actually, because of the negative tax rates. And then up here is equalized value per pupil. So in general, the amount of taxable property, again, you have behind each student, the size of your pool to pull on to raise money for your schools. And we've pulled out a few examples to kind of highlight the point. Over here in Claremont, you can see their equalized value per pupil, about $600,000. Their local education tax rate and SWEP, so the total education tax rate is almost $17 per thousand. With that $17 per thousand, so remember the example before, we're able to raise almost $11,000 per student. Compared to Concord, a lower tax rate than Claremont. Not by a lot, but by a good chunk. And yet, because we have a higher, on average, property value per student, we're raising significantly more money with a lower tax rate. And Concord's a little below average, actually. So you can see this trend. Molten Borough is an extreme example, but it's, the help shows the trend, right? Their tax rate is $3 per thousand, and they're raising $32,000 per student, right? So this is comparing students to students per student. They're able to raise $32,000 with a tax rate significantly lower than Concord or even Claremont. So to kind of show a more concrete example, when I'm saying tax rates, some people are keeping up with that's the way their brain works, but how about dollars out of your pocket? Property tax bills. So let's compare these two communities. One's in Alton, one's in Pittsfield. House on the left is valued at a little over $400,000. House on the right valued at half that, $210,000. And look how much they're paying in their school property taxes. The house on the right is valued at half as much and is paying $200 more a year for their education property taxes because their rates are so much higher. And sometimes we have weird little quirks, like right here in Concord. How can it be that a community where you have going to two different schools, Pennacook's technically a village of Concord, share the same city council, have different school tax rates? This is a particularly funky example, but it's a good one, obviously, because of where we are. But you also find this we'll go to communities where houses are 2 miles down the road, and they happen to be in different towns. And one's paying twice as much in property taxes, just because there's a town line in between. Does anyone know what some of the major indicators for property value are in the state? How you can just guess which communities have the highest property values? Tax base, okay.
That's it. All tax base.
But school quality, what impacts that tax base? School quality? Lakes? Ski resorts? Location. Yeah, but location to what? Generally natural resources. Coastline, lake, ski resort. In general, those are some of the biggest indicators of the property value of a community. And so what this does in New Hampshire is this heavy reliance on property taxes is it creates almost a perfectly regressive tax system. What that means is, in general, the more money you make, in general, the smaller proportion of your income is going to taxes. And some people point out that, well, yeah, but if you make a lot of money, you're still paying a small percent, you're still paying a lot of money. But as I just pointed out, there are examples all over the state where you can have a house that's worth double, triple that of your neighboring town, you're paying the same amount in your property taxes. And the biggest driver behind this regressivity is the property tax. It's the large bar here. So folks making between $45,000 and $72,000 are paying 3 times the rate, 3 times as much of a proportion of their income to property taxes than people making over $500,000. And what you see is that a lot of this is influenced by your ability to pay the entrance fee to get into a community that has those low taxes, right? And so by relying on such a system, it makes it that much harder for people who are not able to get into a community. And then also communities, I was talking to some city councilors from Portsmouth recently, who, if their values are rising so quickly, people are being pushed out of there and are moving to neighboring communities and are paying 2-3 times as much in taxes for houses that are valued significantly lower. And these are just a few of the consequences of a system like this. Another one is teacher salaries. Our friends at Reaching Higher, they're an education policy group that puts out some really good nonpartisan research on education in New Hampshire. Just looked at average teacher salaries. And what you'll see is, and for those of you who know the school districts intimately, this is about a year behind because that's the most recent data we had for everyone in the state. But what you'll see is, in general, teacher salaries follow property value. The ability to raise that money from your property value with a lower tax rate and raise more money per pupil, in general, gives you the flexibility and the control to raise more funds to pay your teachers higher. Something I will point out, a lot of times people like to cite the fact that we in New Hampshire spend a lot of money on public education, on average. Total amount of money spent on public education. We do invest a lot as a state, per pupil, per capita, compared to the rest of the country. The problem is, who is paying for that? And so even in some of these communities that are struggling, they are choosing to invest, they are choosing to actively raise their own property taxes to keep their schools together, to try to meet a higher teacher contract, et cetera. And you can tell, when you're looking at how to attract and retain teachers, New Hampshire's a small state. A $10,000 difference, a $15,000 difference for the same job has dramatic impacts on where people go. Some of my colleagues were in Pittsfield on Friday talking to a group of high school students. They don't have any world languages in Pittsfield right now. They tried to hire some. No one applied because a neighboring community was hiring for the same position at $10,000 more. And so now students in Pittsfield, if they can take any world language classes, are taking them online. To show kind of the severity of this is showing the step increases from the lowest paying school to the highest paying school. If you were to work at the lowest paying school, you have to work through 18 steps, 18 levels of the pay scale to get to the lowest paying step of the highest salaries school in the state. And then, to go back to our example from the beginning, another specific impact here is just access of students to the material, to teachers, different ability to prepare for tests. Standardized test scores are a very specific measure. They capture some things, they miss a lot, right? But look at the disparity here. So, we started with some lawsuits, got to where we are now, deeply inequitable system, and part of what another kind of round of this is engaging in more lawsuits. Part of that is pushing the legislature, pushing a different lever, pulling a different lever there to try to enact change. So John's going to walk through some of the most recent lawsuits and some of the recent wins.
So, thinking about this, one of the things that is going on now, and I think is a motivation for people wanting to change, is that in different parts of the state, people are really sacrificing for their schools. They're really running as hard as they can and sweating a lot and sacrificing a lot, and they still can't keep up. And that problem's been getting worse. So, and it's really the legislature's job to solve it, but the legislature, as we said before, has essentially gone backwards long term for the last 20 years. So a number of people decided that it was time to go back to court. So the first case was the Conval case, and Conval is short for Contoocook Valley Regional School District. It's down in the Peterborough area. They pioneered this, and I want to give them credit. And their lawyers, Michael Tierney and Elizabeth Ewing, and their superintendent, Kimberly Rizzo Saunders, who really said enough is enough is enough. We need to do something about that. And eventually, a whole raft of other school districts joined them, and you can see that list. It includes Manchester and Nashua, the two biggest school districts in the state. It also includes Hopkinton and Hillsborough-Deering from this area. And so this case is 25% of the kids in the public schools in the state are represented in this, in that case. And they were, in lots of ways, being conservative. They were saying instead of $20,000, which is the actual cost, and instead of $4,000, which is what the state is paying, we think base adequacy costs about $10,000. And the Superior Court ruled in their favor without a full trial in 2019. The state appealed that. After 18 months at the Supreme Court sent the case back for a full trial. That trial was held in May. And then a couple of days before Thanksgiving, Judge Ruoff issued a ruling in that case saying that the current number, the $4,100 number, is unconstitutional. And he goes back to the Constitution. He says it's the legislature's job to make that decision, but it's pretty clear to him that 4,100 is not it. And he set a figure, and he came up with some fairly conservative calculations for that. But he said repeatedly in his opinion that the likely number, when the legislature actually gets down to work and looks at this, is likely to be much higher than that 7,300. Because in a number of different ways, the Conval plaintiffs were conservative, and he was, in his opinion. But even at that level of increasing it from 4,100 to 7,300, that would cost the state $537 million. And one of the things that's really important to point out is he's not saying we need to spend another $537 million. We're spending that money now. You and I are all spending that money in our property tax bills. The question is, who pays that $537 million? So how did he come up with that number? And I encourage you, if you have time, to read the decisions. They're on our website. I don't exactly put them under my pillow every night, but I do cherish them. And they are definitely worth reading, both for the numbers and also for the thorough way that he went through, the cautious, thoughtful, practical way that he went through the testimony in the case. And so these are the numbers that he came up with as, again, a very conservative estimate. And again, in red at the bottom of this, we're just quoting him again, that number is in actuality too low and would not survive scrutiny. So one of the things that's most interesting about the decision and also sad is, and I watched the trial. I went over to Brentwood and watched the trial. The state did not present any evidence to justify that $4,100. They had nobody who could come in and say, that's enough. What they did instead was, and the judge reports on this, what they did instead was to try to punch holes in the testimony of all the people that Conval presented. Conval presented 25 or more people from school districts who were dealing with the practical costs of education. And you know, there's an old saw among lawyers, if your case is weak on the law and strong on the facts, you argue the facts. And if it's weak on the facts and strong on the law, you argue the law. And I would add, if it's weak on both the law and the facts, you argue procedure. And that's what the state did. And this is not the fault of the Attorney General, the lawyers in the Attorney General's office. It's the fact that it is not possible to justify the number that the legislature has set. And so the only approach the lawyers were left with was to try to punch holes in what the Conval people were saying. And the court pointed out, the state had nothing to say to justify the current number. So how does this change the current adequacy formula? And if you look at the top two lines, the current number is 4,100 and the new number is 7,300. The difference between that is about 3,200 per pupil. And you can see the average cost per pupil in 2022 was triple that, 21,000. But again, going back to just the difference between the state's number and Judge Ruoff's very conservative number, it's about 3,200. And that is where the 537 million comes from. And again, this is not an increase in funding, it's a shift in who pays. The state is not paying its fair share, and the judge is saying the state has to pick up its fair share, more of its share, and take that burden off local taxpayers. And this is a chart that the folks at the project did. This is the current allocation, and we saw this before, of where money comes from for public education. And you can see it's enormously weighted toward property taxes. And this is what it would look like if the 7,300 figure was implemented. It wouldn't change it radically, but you can see that the property tax part would go down from over 60% to 48%, the local property tax, and the state adequacy part would go up. The green part that exists now would go up by that orange part. So just going this far would start to change the allocation of responsibility, would start to relieve the burden on local property taxpayers. So here's some ideas about how to pay for that money, how the state could relieve the burden on local property taxpayers by substituting their money for different money. Interest and dividends tax, for whatever reason, we've been cutting that even though we've, facing this liability. An additional true swept that everybody paid the same rate of about $2.03. Currently, it's about roughly $2 per thousand. If you added $2 more to that, you could get there. Going back to the business tax levels of 2015. And then on the bottom of here, you can see, again, what the judge said. He's respectful of the legislature's duty. It's a legislative function to allocate money. And so he says the legislature should have the final word, but they can't justify anything lower than his number. And it's actually going to be higher. So there's another case going on, and this is one that I'm working on, and that smiling gentleman there is named Steve Rand. He's a hardware store owner in Plymouth, and he's a taxpayer. He owns his home, and he owns the building where his hardware store is. And so I'm working with Andy Valinsky and Doug Hall and a great young lawyer named Natalie LaFlamme on a taxpayer case. The other cases have always been by school districts and parents, and this one is about taxpayers, because taxpayers are part of the people who suffer from this. So Steve is one of the plaintiffs, and Jessie Wheeler, who put her hand up a little while ago, who's a school board member in Pennacook and a homeowner and taxpayer, stood up and is part of this case. And Bob Gabrielli, who lives in Concord but owns business property in Pennacook, he's a formal plaintiff. His wife, Beth, is an informal plaintiff, and they are here tonight, and really appreciate them standing up. They are right there. And we have somebody from Hopkinton. We have somebody from Newport, because these are all places where the current system hurts unfairly. So what we're saying is that in the Rand case on behalf of taxpayers is because the rates aren't uniform is unconstitutional. And now, applying what the judge said in Conval, right now the state would say, if we're right that the number is 4,100, then all the extra that we're all paying on our local school taxes is for fluff. It's for extras. It's not adequacy. It's for fluff. And therefore, if local towns want to have fluff, they each get to pay for it with their own tax rates. But now Judge Ruoff has said, oh no, the number's not 4,100, it's 7,300. So that difference between setting it at 4,100 and 73 makes all those tax rates everywhere that are now raising that difference at different rates unconstitutional. So that's the heart of the Rand case. That once the true cost of adequacy is set, we can all see that we've all been paying through local property taxes to bail out the state, and that has to come to an end. So we're also challenging the levels of base adequacy. We think it's actually higher than 7,300. We think it's higher than 10,000. And we also, in the Rand case, are taking on the cost of some of the sort of auxiliary pieces of adequacy. What extra does it cost to educate a special ed kid, or a kid from poverty, or a kid who's an English language learner? So those are part of the Rand case as well. So far in Rand, we don't have a final decision. We were supposed to have a trial in September, and the judge put it off so he could work on the Conval case. But we have two decisions from him that we got recently on two important issues. One is that it's unconstitutional for these wealthy towns to keep the extra swept and use it for their local education. That everybody has to pay the same swept rate, wealthy town, not wealthy town, because it's a state tax. It's not for the town, it's for students everywhere. The kids in Portsmouth and the kids in Claremont are all our kids. They're all the state's obligation, and we have to pay for them at the same rate. Then the other thing, and I think I mentioned, we didn't even know about negative tax rates when we started the case. But it turns out that for years, the Department of Revenue Administration has essentially been giving a big tax break to property owners in small towns where there weren't students, on the theory, again, that it's only a local responsibility, and if they don't have students in school, then we'll let them off the hook. And so what Doug has researched is there's some incredibly luxury houses in some of these small unincorporated places that are not paying the swept at all. And the process for getting there was the DRAs assessing the swept and then wiping it out with a negative tax rate. And Judge Ruoff said that's unconstitutional too. So you can see that that means, in terms of the excess swept, $26 million should come into the state and go into the pot to take care of all kids. And in terms of the negative tax rates, you can see a very big chunk of valuable property is getting assessed at very low rates. And so there's more money that can come from those homeowners so that they pay their fair share. So now that we have had these decisions, the next thing is to go back to the legislature. While the cases are likely to be appealed, and that will probably take another 12 to 18 months. And so Zach's going to talk about the legislative activity, but before he does that, I just want to say, wouldn't it be nice if the state decided not to appeal? In Pennsylvania, there was a recent big school funding decision at the trial court level, and that state government said, instead of fighting it for another couple of years, we're not going to appeal, we're going to sit down and try to figure it out. And wouldn't it be nice if our governor and attorney general and legislative leaders came to that decision? It would save time, it would really get to the heart of this. Instead, I'm afraid some of them are going to run out the clock, but we're going to keep saying, wouldn't it be nice if they didn't appeal? So here's Zach to talk about legislative action.
And one more piece to kind of lead into the last section here, and then we're open up for Q&A, is I just want to pause for a second. Court rulings should mean something. And like court rulings, Supreme Court, like that's their job, is to interpret the Constitution, interpret and dictate rulings on what shouldn't be done, cannot be done. And we try to pull out some of the best quotes from the rulings, but Judge Ruoff, who is the same judge for both cases, was very, very clear in how much the state's been failing its responsibility, how over-the-top conservative he was getting his numbers, and how explicitly it is the legislature's job to fix it. That should mean something, right? And so part of what we do and part of what you can do, and I know some of you have and continue to, is help engage with legislators. It does make a difference. It does matter. There are some here if you want to corner them after this. But just for some examples, kind of in the most recent budget session. So the most recent session last year was the state budget process, and school funding was a significant issue. The House is basically divided in half, and there's only a few votes difference between the majority and the minority party. And so compromise and bipartisanship are, especially with a bill like the budget, are forced and are absolutely necessary to get anything passed. And one of the main pieces in the House was school funding. And there was a significant increase in school funding this past year. There are a few provisions in there that would have been a little more detrimental that were taken out. There were some elements added in. There was some more targeted aid put in to try to get some money to communities with lower property values, which are all good things. And I point this out to point out that engaging with legislators, showing up, testifying does make a difference, does have an impact. However, to put it in context of one of the largest increases we've had recently in school funding is that little yellow line. Right? So it does matter. It does make an impact, but we have a long way to go. And on the other hand, a lot of these changes were paid for by, taking money out of the other hand in some specific areas. We had this aid category called stabilization aid. It's about $160 million a year, went to communities that largely had higher concentrations of students in poverty, lower property values, and needed that extra money. So we kind of cut that in order to pay for some of the increases in other areas. And one of the things that were enacted is this idea called hold harmless. And again, I want to kind of paint this picture to show that this is a long-term problem, long-term consequences, and a lot of times the legislature is thinking in 2-year chunks. What's the next election? What's the next piece? Like just very kind of small chunks. And in New Hampshire, the legislature flips back and forth very often. We're going to have a new governor next year. There's often, there's a lot of turnover, and a lot of times decisions are made on kind of 2-year pieces. So this whole harmless grant idea was enacted to make sure that in the next 2 years, no one will get hurt. No community will receive less funding from that huge chunk of stabilization aid that was taken away. But after that, it'll start tapering off. And largely rural communities, largely communities with higher concentrations of students of poverty, with lower property values, will start to see less funding. So it'll be the next legislature's problem to deal with. And this is a pattern that happens all the time, not just in education funding. And going back to revenue, where is the state going to pay for, where is the state going to find additional funding to pay for either the rulings that just came out of the court or hopefully going above and beyond that? In this past legislative session, we went backwards on some of the degrees. So the interest and dividends tax, which we've mentioned a few times, I just want to highlight specifically because it was one of the few taxes we had in New Hampshire that targeted ability to pay, targeted wealth generally, right? So in general, and these numbers are from the Fiscal Policy Institute, over half of the revenue from that came from folks making more than $200,000 a year just in income from their interest and dividends. You have to have a very large amount of wealth to generate that much income just on interest and dividends. Were some people paying this tax that are not extremely wealthy? Yes, right? But the solution to just wipe the whole thing out is not doing that in an equitable way. It is doing it in a cutting taxes for cutting taxes' sake. And just for reference, that money could have paid for all schools in all of our paid for lunch in every single school in the state. Just an idea. So looking forward to next session, kind of some specific ways to get engaged, kind of where do we go from here? We've spent the summer, small chunk of the summer, a lot of other things too, meeting with a handful of legislators, answering questions, talking about the lawsuits, and there are a handful of bills that were filed back in September, that could address some of these issues coming up. One is basically the Conval lawsuit. It would just increase base adequacy, the amount that every school district gets per student, from $4,100 to $10,000. That's what the Conval lawsuit was asking for. The judge came in the middle, $7,300. But this is a specific piece of legislation that is addressing this specific ruling that just came out of the Conval lawsuit. So it's a way we can isolate that conversation, talk about, is that too much? Is that not enough? How would we pay for it? What would the impact be on different school districts? How much would different school boards and different communities benefit from having that burden shifted? There's a number of bills looking at special education costs. Special education, John mentioned that the state gives about $2,300 per student. It costs, on average, $27,000 per student. That's a huge range there. Some students cost significantly more than others. But averages are helpful to understand. The state's giving $2,300, acknowledging that there are additional costs associated with making sure students who need special education services get the services they need. They acknowledge that. They give extra money. But they give $2,300 compared to the $27,000 on average. So there's some bills they're looking at. What would it look like to increase that amount? How much should we do? Why? What would the impact be? There's also a bill sponsored by one of the reps in the back that is largely coming out of the Commission to Study School Funding. There's a bill that Representative Leno has put in 2 years ago. And this would look at a lot of the pieces that came out of the Commission to Study School Funding that are trying to redistribute and look at how the money is flowing out of the state, from the state, in a much more equitable way. It also would address some of the discrepancies in SWEP that we've talked about, and I believe a few other pieces that I'm forgetting. There's a very comprehensive bill. But again, is this a solution? What pieces of this do people want? How do we engage and make sure this is a conversation that's had, looked at seriously, and we try to understand what pieces we can take from this moving forward. This bill would do exactly the same thing that just came out of the Rand ruling. So we have two bills here that would address specifically the two rulings from the Rand and Conval lawsuit. This bill would change it so you can't have negative tax rates that John just went over, and not let communities keep excess swept. That would just fix that part of the lawsuit if the legislature passed that. The ruling would be moot. We'd have fixed it. And then there's another bill to reinstate the interest and dividends tax. Again, a conversation about who's paying, where the money is coming from, and who's shouldering this burden. So to just summarize at a high level, this is a situation, the education funding, property taxes, hits both taxpayers and students for a lot of different reasons, but they're compounded in specific communities. It's not a stagnant problem. It is continuing to get worse, but we are having significant wins and significant positive steps, both in the legislative session recently, hopefully in the one coming up next year, and the court rulings. The state is downshifting this responsibility, the blue part of the pie. One way to look at that is the state downshifting that responsibility, which is kind of the crux of the Rand lawsuit, to the tune of about $2 billion a year that we are currently paying as local property taxpayers to support a public education system. It's unconstitutional, and specifically the solution lies with state-level lawmakers, right? This is a legislative branch ability to fix this, address it, change who's paying, change where the money is coming from. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Casey to talk a little bit more about some specific ways you all can get engaged, and then we're happy to answer questions from folks.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, folks. I'm Casey. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Director for the project. So now that we're armed with all of this great information from Zach and John about the nature of this issue and how the inequities manifest in our own community here in Concord and all around the state, the question is kind of, what do we do to move the ball forward? So as Zach mentioned, we have all this great legislation coming up. We have a great opportunity with the court rulings to really set the tone for this legislative session and the budget cycle coming up in 2025. Something that we would ask you to do immediately today is you got these postcards on your way in. And if you fill these out and return them back to project staff before you leave, we're going to send them to the legislature. For the ones we get here today, we'll send them to the Concord area reps, and we're going to keep this campaign going for the rest of our presentations going forward. At the end of the day, the legislature is accountable to you, the folks who elect them into office. So let them know that you want to see change on this issue, or you're not going to elect them back into office. So other things that you can do to get involved, we have a newsletter that goes out once a month. As we approach the legislative session, we will be sending out action alerts as issues arise in the legislature, as the bills come up for hearings and so on. Last year, we had over 600 people contact their state reps as things were coming up, and we were able to move the ball forward on a lot of the legislation that was relevant last year. So make sure you're on our newsletter list. Share our information on social media. This presentation and a recording of it, we've got the Concord Community Television folks here recording it tonight. So little round of applause for them. They've really helped us out tonight. So we'll have that up on our website probably as soon as tomorrow, and you can share the presentation with your friends and family. We've got stuff going up on social media, new content pretty regularly. So the project staff is also always available to answer questions. Our contact information's on the website. Most of us are here tonight. We've got Carly and Michaela. If you guys could just raise your hands so folks know where to, yeah, woohoo! So you can return the postcards to myself, Zach, Carly, or Michaela at the end of this. And yeah, if we can just work together to keep the pressure on, I think that, you know, we can all hope to see some change on this in the next year or two here. So I will run this mic around to do Q&A. I think we can go ahead and start that now.
Yeah.
All right. Louise.
Thank you for a terrific program. So I had a question. One, who are the actual plaintiff defendants in these lawsuits? And we saw that Claremont, the promise at Claremont was never fulfilled. And these are great rulings. But what are the enforcement mechanisms if, you know, clearly Claremont was ignored? So what can we do to try to ensure that these are enforced?
Those are great questions, and those are questions we are thinking about a lot, as you might expect. First of all, in terms of who the defendants, the state government is the defendant, and that means the governor. In Conval, the governor and the legislative leaders are the defendants, not personally in the sense that anybody's going to take their house, but in their official roles. In terms of how we enforce this, well, the first thing is we got to make sure that the Supreme Court affirms these decisions. And I think they're really strong decisions. They're really well written. They are absolutely built brick by brick on the prior decisions. So, you know, 30 years ago we were making new law. Now we're just enforcing the law because the state has fallen down on its duty. In taking the step that Judge Ruoff did of picking a number, that's the first step. Now there's a number. None of the judges have ever picked a number before. And so he's basically said the number's got to be at least that much. If the state, and I think he probably, and even though he said it's not enough, it's clearly not enough, I think what he was trying to avoid was the legislature saying, you don't like 4,100? How about 4,200? He was really trying to set a meaningful benchmark to say, you don't play games. It's this big number, and it's likely to be a lot further. It will depend on what the legislature does. What I can tell you is we've been thinking a lot, and I don't want to get ahead of the game. We haven't won at the Supreme Court yet, although I'm quite optimistic about that. But in other states, what has happened when a legislature has been recalcitrant is sometimes the court has set a deadline, you have to do it by this, and sometimes they've set a deadline, the system closes down if you don't do it by this date. In some states, they've said, we're going to impose fines on legislative leaders in, I forget which state it was, $100,000 a day, the money to go into the state budget. So we're not there yet, but there's an array of gradually sort of escalating steps to force compliance. And I think that if the court starts to do that, the legislature will follow the oaths that they all took to enforce the Constitution. I mean, the judges and the legislators all take the same oath. They take the oath to follow the Constitution. And the court is saying, you're making us spell it out again because you're not doing it. Please follow your oath. And so we hope that they will. If they don't, I think there will be sort of gradual steps to push them to do it, with hopefully with consequences.
Just say one quick thing. So you and Andrew Valinsky and all the other lawyers in these cases give lawyers a good name. So thank you for that, for your work.
Hello, I'm just curious. I see the 4.1% slice that is allocated to the New Hampshire lottery, and the the payouts are somewhat obscene, but lucky be the soul that wins something. I'm just wondering if there's some additional funding that could be taken from that piece of the pie. And has anyone ever done a study on what the New Hampshire lottery supports other than the winner?
So, fair question. The lottery by law, all of the money it generates minus operations, staff, and winnings, all of that has to go to the Education Trust Fund. So it doesn't go anywhere else other
That's
than
4.1%.
and it's only 4.1%.
It's quite a machine.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's
1% of the total funding.
yeah.
4.1% of the lottery.
I'm sorry.
So
In the back. What's the
this is
explanation?
4.1% of the total revenue for all of public education in New Hampshire.
Okay.
But that 4.1% represents 100% of the money from the lottery minus staff, operations, and winnings that they pay out.
Has that been the percentage since the inception of the lottery?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure it's changed over time, but it's I'm not sure. It has not. I would be surprised if it has been significantly more than that, percent-wise.
Thank you.
That's not a fixed percentage. That's just what the lottery has generated as compared to all the other money that's being generated. It's just what it happened to be that year. Because my tongue-in-cheek suggestion is they could spend a little less money on touting the lottery and how much money is brought into education, a little less advertising money, and put a little more money in the pot. But
Thank you for the presentation. And I know you noted in 1999 was one of the years in which there was almost an income tax, and then the governor at the time voted no. And I know a lot of organizations are also hesitant to support an income tax because of the political climate in which we live in, and also elected officials taking the pledge. But if that is the only avenue in order to meet the 18,500, how do we get there? What are the steps to get there? Are there alternative means to get there? Or do we not want to go there? Thank you.
Yeah, so to tie a bit more context on that, we bring that up because that was, so after the Claremont 2 rulings, to kind of show that there were these major Supreme Court rulings, and then there was a lot of engagement and pressure on and engagement with legislators that resulted in policy change. One of them being that an income tax, which at that point also was not very politically viable. The Speaker of the House at the time was adamantly opposed to that, and yet the House ended up passing it. And just to be clear, the governor never actually touched the bill, just said that she would we would veto it, and that effectively killed it. But the point being that that created significant legislative openings that maybe had not seemed open before. We are getting this question a lot, basically, okay, so how do we solve it? What's the one answer, right? And there is no one answer, right? And some are going to be more politically viable than others, right? But one answer that is definitely not helpful is pretending it's not a problem. Or saying, well, we'll just wait until the next court ruling. Or, well, we'll just wait until there's more pressure or till we win a different election, or, right? And so part of this is engaging with the fact that this needs to be solved, has to be solved, is being demanded by the courts. So I don't know if I'm giving kind of a roundabout answer. I mean, you could increase the statewide property tax. That's, property is a significant amount of wealth to tax. I think the answer lies somewhere in the messy middle of a combination of a whole bunch of different revenue sources, but definitely not talking about how to raise additional revenue.
Just for informational purposes, who was that governor and what were her reasons?
It was Governor Shaheen.
Yeah. And what was her reason?
I don't know her stated reason.
I know what it was.
But I think the perceived reason was, it was not politically viable for future.
The legislature passed it, got to her, and she decided whether it's politically viable.
Yeah, so the House passed it, and then it went to the Senate, and she said that she was going to veto it, and the Senate kind of was like, okay, well, we're not going to go out on a limb.
During the lengthy time that I've been working on this, we've had 6 governors, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and none of them has really faced this, to be blunt. And we've had the legislature in different hands, and sometimes, the legislature in 1999, which was a Republican legislature, took some significant steps. In 2019, it was a Democratic legislature, took some steps. This past year, as Zach described, the legislature, which was sort of split, took some modest steps. We really need to push them all. And I would say, what needs to be done in some ways is to form a coalition. In some ways the biggest slide up there, and Zach alluded to this, is the one that shows that 3/4 of the people in the state live in districts that get screwed by this system. So we need to be talking to people in Derry and Pittsfield and Allenstown and all over the place. Some of those places elect R's, some of them elect D's. And we need to talk to them, and our legislative allies need to talk to those legislators and just say, let's find some common cause here. We're all getting screwed. And the legislators who are here tonight, who were here in 2019, will remember that when the legislature had set in some prior motions to sort of a process cutting state aid, and that got raised, the legislators from Derry and all those other places, they heard from their constituents, and they voted to not do that anymore, to take care of their constituents. So whatever the party, whatever the ideology, if they hear from their constituents, they will respond. There are some legislators who are so ideologically driven they don't care what their constituents say, but most legislators do care. They just need to hear from people. And I've had many legislators tell me, if I hear from 10 people on an issue, that really gets me to pay attention. And you don't have to know it like this. All you have to say is, my property taxes are killing me. What are you going to do about it?
Dave?
Great. Thanks, Casey, and thanks, Zach and John. John, a quick question for you. This is Dave Luno from Hopkinton. If the Rand injunction does not get appealed, what would be the timing of the injunctive relief that the judge granted to taxpayers?
The judge said that it all should start with the new tax year that starts April 1st. So that would be the school budgets that and the sort of property tax year that starts at that time. And we had asked for an injunction more than a year ago, and the state said there's not a good time for this. People are making decisions. Well, now a year's gone by, and there's the same response: not a good time. People are making decisions. I think the judge heard enough about that, and he said, there's no good time, but I'm going to set this time. So it's, if the state appeals, it's fairly likely that that decision will get stayed. Very often when a trial court makes a decision and there's an appeal, the trial court or the appeals court says, we're going to put this on ice until we decide. So that certainly could happen.
Gotta run up the stairs every time.
Thank you. I just have a question. What would how could we prevent the legislature from letting the Department of Education give this increased money to the education freedom accounts? Because that's something that's what they're doing, is they're giving the state portion to the education freedom accounts. How can we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is policy change, just like the laws that were passed that created the education freedom account / voucher program. That was a policy change that created that, and there's been policy changes both last year and next year that will, there's proposals that will dramatically expand it, some that will shrink it. So the short answer is that it's all through bills that we pass the legislature, and same amount of, what we've been talking about is like engagement and showing people that largely the answer is not to siphon more money away from a cash-strapped system, right? A lot of what we're talking about is a lack of funding from the state for our public schools, so diverting additional dollars of that is definitely not helping.
Please don't take this as a criticism, because it's not. I think you guys are doing a great job. I hesitated to come to this tonight because I knew I was going to walk out of here pissed off and frustrated. And I look around the room, and we have the choir. This is all the choir. Anybody here surprised at what you heard tonight? No, not at all. So I guess my question to you is, do you have a roadshow version of this? Are you going to PTAs? Are you talking to parents? Are you talking to school boards? Because I actually have lived in a tale of two cities. 15 years on the budget committee in Londonderry, where we transitioned from property poor, crazy growing school system, very high taxes, late 80s, early 90s. Then Londonderry caught fire. Really, the airport really took off, the base took off, taxes went down. They built edifices for police stations and town halls and everything. Now for the last 9 years, I've lived in Raymond. Yeah, exactly, okay? It is disgusting. I mean, just disgraceful. And I get so frustrated because these people keep electing people who don't give a shit. They just don't give a shit. So my question was going to be to you, and I think I kind of got the roundabout answer, that this doesn't seem to be falling along party lines, although I find that really hard to believe. I would tend to think in my gut that Democrats are more in favor of equitable funding than Republicans. But then again, we had a Democratic governor who chickened out when she had the chance. So I'm not crazy about them either, but I think that these people here have been fighting this fight for a long time. I have since 1987, when I first got on the budget committee. I knew it was a problem. I have a friend my best friend lives in Rye. He has a house that's valued about $1.8 million. I live in Raymond in a house that's valued about $300,000. I pay over $5,000 in taxes. He pays about $13,000, $14,000 in taxes. So his house is worth 6 times mine, yet he only pays slightly more than double what I pay in taxes. And if that's not an illustration of the bullshit, I mean, that really brings it home. So talking to us is great, and we're going to do what we can. I'm going to send the postcard in. I'm going to talk to my legislatures, even though I'm going to might as well talk to that wall over there. But you got to get this out on the road. You've got to get this in front of school boards and PTAs. Because there are any parents of school-aged children in here? Right, 5?
Well, thank you
5?
for being here.
It's got to be more than, it has to be more than that. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated.
Well, yeah, let me answer. So, first off, yeah, this is our 35th one of these this year, I think. And we were recently in Wolfboro, Hampstead, Hudson, Hinsdale, all starting with H. I'm not sure why. We'd love to come to Raymond. We have a open door policy. We go to anyone, anywhere, anytime. We present to school boards. The Goffstown School Board asked us to come in at a school board meeting and just do this to their school board. Kind of all, the whole gamut, I guess, is the short answer. Some folks in Rye last week were trying to get one going for Hampton. So yeah, we do this all over the place, and sometimes there's audiences that in general are more interested, I guess. But the thing is that all those places I just listed, we get big groups of people that are here who have similar questions to you. They might have different preconceived notions, but it's very hard to find anyone in New Hampshire that doesn't care about either property taxes and or schools, period. Most people have pretty strong feelings and connections to both of those, and so showing them the connection there is a lot of what we do. And I think, to appreciate, part of our goal is to get people pissed off and frustrated, right? And I just, I also want to say, we are a political engaged organization. We are a nonprofit, so we are nonpartisan. So there's a lot of lines to walk with issues that are so politically charged. But I would challenge everyone here who thinks that the folks who represent them are good to go, don't need to hear from you. Just would challenge that notion, because even to your point of a Democratic governor, if you might think in general Democrats are one way on this, maybe that challenged that. So sometimes some people need pressure, sometimes people need support, right? And so I would really encourage everyone to reconsider what you can do to engage with your elected officials, because sometimes they might be ready to go there, but might feel like they're stepping out on a limb. So hearing from people, your words, the choir, can be incredibly powerful as well.
Add to that. I think there are a number of Republican legislative, office holders who are sympathetic to this, who understand this, who've come to these presentations. And if you sit them down one by one, by themselves, they get it. They just don't know what to do about it. But they understand it, and they know something needs to be done. They need to hear from their constituents. So they need to, whoever your rep is or senator is, you need to get in touch with them, but you need to make sure that they hear from 10 other people. I'm thinking of, I hate to name names, but Senator Birdsell from Derry. She understands this. She's been to our presentation. She gets it. She just needs to hear from her constituents that they want to solve it. And so I think, as Zach said, this property tax issue has been simmering for years. This is, in some ways, we were explaining it tonight, but we don't need to explain it much. The rates keep going up, and it's really hard to bear. So I think there's a lot of latent potential on this issue, but we just need to do our democracy, do our civics, get people to contact them. And one of the things I would say is the people at the Kent Street Coalition and the people at Americans for Prosperity, there are ways to do that. There are ways to get through to politicians, and we just need to do that. And that's what we're trying to do. But it's really on all of us and all of you, to do that. That's what will make change. And it has made change in other areas.
Recognizing the time, we're going to do one more. Val has hand for a bit. One more question. I don't want to hold people here, so we'll do one more, and then we're happy to kind of stay and chat after. But
thank you. I'm Val Zanchuk. I was on the School Funding Commission. If you go back to our slide, the bottom of it talks about the linear relationship between the poor communities and the outcomes of education. And I think today's discussion was much about taxes, but to me the real outrage is the fact that the quality of education is a function of zip code in this state. not area code. And to get it to be a function of area code so that it's universal, obviously the funding will have to change, but I think to me the real outrage is that we are allowing our students to be inadequately educated, and it's affecting not only them personally, but it affects the state, it affects our economy, it affects our workforce. So there's more to this than just the taxes, which is, let's say, a homeowner adult situation. From an economic standpoint, from the growth of the state, from the equity of education across the state. To me, the real outrage is that we are letting our students down. And I would just love to have a mother from Rye sit down from a mother from Berlin and tell her that she doesn't give a shit about her kid and that she's not willing to help fund that kid's education, because that's exactly what's happening. And if you did it on a person-to-person basis, I'd have a hard time thinking that one mother would tell another mother that she doesn't care about her kid's education. But until people start thinking of themselves as citizens of the state of New Hampshire instead of their little enclave of wealth or prosperity, it's going to be very, very difficult to get past this.
I think that's as good a note as any to end on. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your support.